Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our series with the Howard University School of Social Work. The series is called Mental Health, The Struggle is Real, and we're reaffirming our strengths in the Black community. This in partnership with blackdoctor.org and supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, or SAMHSA. My name is Kais Washington, and I represent Howard University as a 2024 alum from the School of Social Work. I'm affiliated with the Howard School-based mental health program through the Department of Psychiatry and the College of Medicine, and I'm a research assistant through Princeton University. We're delighted to have you join us today as we discuss the political decisions on vulnerable populations. And I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join this discussion. It's a pleasure to have you in the room with me. So we can get started with the presentation. So, an overview. We will highlight the importance of understanding the connection between political decisions and vulnerable populations. I do want to give a disclaimer. The content in this presentation does not reflect the views of Howard University, SAMHSA, blackdoctor.org, or my own. My goal is to disseminate information and provide evidence for your own interpretation. The sources references will be included on the reference slides at the end of the presentation, and I encourage you to read these articles for your own so you can have your own comprehensive understanding of the topics at hand. So going into the outline, we're going to start with a grounding or mindfulness exercise. Then we're going to talk about vulnerable populations, multidisciplinary experimentation, some real world ripple effects, Black voter turnout, mental health, some roles of advocacy, actionable steps, and some suggested solutions before we open it up for a Q&A. So now let me share my screen. We will do a mindfulness body scan. And I just want to say, it will tell you to close your eyes and sit a certain way, but do what is most comfortable for you. We really want to make sure that we set the tone for this conversation so it can be productive and we can receive this information. We have to check in with our body.
B, we've got nowhere to go and nothing we have to do. Bring your attention to the top of your body, your face, and notice any tension you might be holding in your jaw. Let it go. Moving down to your shoulders. Let them hang free. From your shoulders down into your arms. Let go of any tightness in your hands. Take your attention now to your stomach. If you're holding any tension there, let it go. Taking the focus down into your legs and into your feet. Let them hang free. Bring your attention to your breathing. Noticing where you feel it most in your body as you breathe in and out. Perhaps it's the air going in through your nose, or as your chest and stomach move with your breath. See if you can notice the exact moment your breath changes from breathing in to breathing out. Gently bring your focus back to your body on your seat. And in your own time, open your eyes.
Okay, slowly bring yourself back in the room with us. Okay, so now we're going to go into the topic at hand, and I want to start by defining vulnerable populations. So what does it mean for someone to be vulnerable? That means that they're susceptible to physical or emotional attack or harm. So as you see on the right, I've listed off some examples of vulnerable populations. I want you to take a moment just to acknowledge one population in the chat. It could be something from this list, or it could be something that is not on this list, but acknowledge at least one vulnerable population. So vulnerability refers to the degree of which a population or an individual is susceptible to harm or neglect, influenced both by inherent and acquired risk factors. So whenever we talk about inherent, that's talking about things that you're born with, like your age, your sex, and your race. Whenever we go to acquired, that's things like from your environment, right? That could be your health behaviors, social cultural behaviors, things that people around you do, family traditions. Vulnerable populations are groups and communities. They're at higher risk for poor physical, psychological, or social health. And barriers can further be intensified due to social, economic, political, and environmental factors. There are some limitations due to illness or disability that can also influence the vulnerability of a population as well. Moving forward to the next part, socially vulnerable populations are at heightened risk during public health emergencies because of factors like their socioeconomic status and all these other things that I mentioned. And social vulnerability refers to the resilience of communities when confronted by external stresses on human health, such as natural or human-caused disasters or disease outbreaks, as we've seen with COVID. So to understand vulnerable populations a little more, I use the CDC and the ATSDR. They came up with a social vulnerability index, which is called the SVI, but it uses 16 US Census variables from a 5-year American Community Survey, or the ACS. And this identifies communities that may need support before, during, or after disasters. So if you look at the graphic that's on the left, there are variables grouped into 4 themes: socioeconomic status, household characteristics, racial and ethnic minority status, housing type, and transportation. These are the 4 main areas of social vulnerability, and then they're combined into a single measure for an overall social vulnerability with the index. The way that the SVI is used, it's used many ways by different people. So for emergency planners, they use it to decide the number of emergency personnel needed so they can plan the best way to evacuate people and account for socially vulnerable populations. For example, we just had Hurricane Milton that went through Florida, and it caused over $30 billion in damage. The SVI informed people how much resources were needed through the entire sequence of that. The same thing can be said for public health officials. They use it to see how many emergency shelters were needed or the number of supplies were needed, especially during COVID-19, especially for the unhoused as well. Then going to the state and local health departments and nonprofits, they use it to look to see how we can guide community-based health promotion initiatives. So it's very useful information that we can pull from these maps and graphs. And then if you look at the map, if you look at the bottom in the south and on the west coast, you see a lot of blue. And at the bottom, I don't know if y'all can see that, but the yellow means low. The next one, the little light green, is low to medium. The teal is medium to high, and then the blue is high levels of vulnerability. High levels of vulnerability are seen all across the South, right? And there's lower rates in the North and the Midwest. And we're not saying that that vulnerable populations don't exist there, because there are vulnerable populations everywhere, but they're more concentrated in these Southern and Western states. So with multidisciplinary experimentation, I feel like this could be a very great approach to use whenever thinking about policy. Starting with policy experiments, I looked at a 2018 multi-case analysis of how policy experiments can influence political decision makers. And it was found that those with political power are in favor of policy experimentation. Most of these decision makers agree that limiting inclusion and isolating experts from policy makes the experiment less credible. But I just want to highlight there are some good and, I guess, bad experiments that have affected communities in a negative light. But all of these are useful to inform, to see how these policies can work if they are to be implemented. So the reason why they can kind of be a little bit weird to use sometimes is because you have to consider equitable needs of the community. We want to heal and not harm. And there are some concerns from community members, such as lack of informed consent, and experimental findings may lack external validity. And these are all things that we have to account for, especially from an experimental standpoint. So moving forward with the inclusion of experts. So a lot of people are concerned about this due to uneasiness around transparency and accountability. A lot of misinformation is being openly spread during this time. So concerns are to be acknowledged and addressed. But public mistrust of experts and a denigration of expertise has been on the rise, and we have to be mindful of what the implications may be because of that. There needs to be a shift in the mindset of what experts actually do, because experts like myself, we come in to inform, providing both quantitative or qualitative data, not to make changes, but to inform. The same approach that I'm using for this presentation. I don't want to give you all this information to make your mind so you can make a decision. I want to give you this information so you can make your own informed decision. So here's the evidence. Make your own decision based off the data, essentially. There are governor appointed experts like the Surgeon General. So biases can be drawn, especially within political positions that they're appointed to, and data can be manipulated. But that's why there needs to be a push for independent experts who come in just to consult, just to be like, hey, I think we should go this way, to counsel with the administrations. Moving forward to evidence-based practice, or in the School of Social Work at Howard, we call it research-informed practice. But we use this because it prevents unsafe and inefficient practices. The NASW, or the National Association of Social Workers, they define it as a process in which the practitioner combines well-researched interventions with clinical expertise, ethics, client preferences, and culture to guide and inform the delivery of treatments and services. So through its implementation, there are some challenges though, because there's gaps between research, bureaucracy, and all their processes, and practice. So we have to find a way to kind of merge these gaps together to where we can all collaborate together collectively. And that kind of feeds into a multidisciplinary approach. So multidisciplinary is combining or involving several academic disciplines or professions in approach to a topic or problem to find solutions. And data can highlight the crucial role of multidisciplinary teams for creativity in education, organization, and research fields. For example, I'm a school social worker by day. I use multidisciplinary teams for many reasons, but I want to show you this one as an example. Whenever I go into an IEP meeting, it's not only me as a social worker saying what I want. I have to collaborate both with the student, the parent, the teachers, other support staff, everything. It's a multidisciplinary approach to find a solution for a student. The same thing as a researcher. I've done research as a social worker with people in communications, in computer science, because I know that I'm not the expert in those areas. So I go and find people who do know these things, and I use them for their expertise because they spent a lot of time in these fields and getting their degrees, getting licenses and things like that. Like I said before, independent experts should inform, not decide. Bringing it back to the Surgeon General that I mentioned, he does inform the president of evidence-based decisions to make. But we also have to consider that in this multidisciplinary approach, if we want to use it this way, we have to consider politicians as the bureaucratic experts in the context of this, because they are the legal experts. We have to trust them to know the legal processes to get where we're trying to go. Also, shared decision-making should be something that we can collaborate with as well, because it's used in medical practice. But it's a process where patients and providers both collaborate to select a treatment option that aligns both with the patient's preferences and the clinical context. So we know that non-white and older individuals are more likely to have low health literacy, which limits their ability to engage in SDM. But I want to tie it into political literacy. We need to mobilize for local issues and touch the community, because some people don't know about council meetings that are happening right in their own neighborhood. And we also need to stress the importance of voting in local elections, because representation matters. Representation through your Senate and your House of Representatives for federal issues starts with your local elections. Governor for state, mayor, and the city council. You all vote for these people in your local elections. So make sure we get out and vote for these things. Right? So now I'm going to take a few seconds just to highlight a few real world ripple effects that you have seen. So in the chat, use the chat. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. What is an example of a real world ripple effect that you have seen due to a policy's implementation? It could be any example. Okay, we see the SNAP program. Okay, let me have two more. DACA, yes. I'll talk about immigration in a few slides, yes. One more. Okay, book bans, parents' rights and education. Okay, thank y'all so much. So I have four that I want to share with y'all. The first one will be COVID 19. COVID 19 obviously has significantly impacted our society. Vulnerable populations were at heightened risk for exposure, as well as adverse health and social consequences. Evidence from three different studies that I've looked at portray that there is a rate of infection and death that mirrors the general patterns of social inequities, notably based on race and income. This kind of feeds into resource availability. Everybody was buying bleach and corporations were hiking up prices, due to supply and demand. But there's already a barrier whenever you're on a fixed income and you're living one check away from homelessness. These people still need these same products too. So why can we have access to that? But we have to understand that policymakers were also operating under difficult circumstances with limited scientific evidence. Scientific understanding was rapidly evolving day to day, which means many decisions were made in the context of a lack of sound scientific evidence to guide the decision making process. Their goal is to make a crucial policy that maximizes impact while also mitigating harm. And they were doing that with limited scientific evidence because everything was new. But I want to assert that it is best practice to always be putting preventative measures in place while you're trusting experimental design. Because you learn about it in middle school, you have your hypothesis, your variables. Scientists are doing this all the time. But if we don't know any information or we have limited information, it would be best to be preventative to where we don't have as many casualties, deaths, whatever it may be. Moving forward, we want to talk about immigration. So Randall and Osman did a study released in 2022, and it was based in Sweden. When seeking asylum, children seem satisfied with having their basic needs met, like housing, food, and support. I just want to sidebar and say this is the bare minimum on the hierarchy of needs. There will be a need for additional in-depth support to supplement these basic services. But this was in Sweden. We have to understand the context. Now, all jurisdictions in Sweden are obligated by law to receive and claim responsibility for unaccompanied refugee minors who are seeking asylum. And then social services are also required to ensure that the child receives the same support and assistance from their Social Services Act legislation. So we have countries that are already having things in place and they're working. My question is, can we use other countries' success as examples to replicate? But moreover, social supports and trusting relationships were a cornerstone for the well-being of minors. And we should also make sure that social supports are in place for people, especially if they are vulnerable. So some considerations that we have to think about. Encourage people to be mindful of the verbiage that's used when referring to marginalized populations. We see it in the media, illegal immigrants versus undocumented migrants, Belinda Jarlova, she said in a paper that was published by the American Economic Review that word choice does matter. And you see her quote at the top. I'll read it for us. One lesson that partisan language can be used in a way that may influence what some people think about policy relevant issues. Perhaps we should be careful about the language and think about how we use language and think about what consequences it may have. Migrant intersectionality affects experiences and oppression and privilege. Think about it this way. An immigrant from the UK will not have the same experience as an immigrant from Haiti. So, resources, like I said, they should be easily accessible because in America, it was built on having the American dream. We should have resources available for those who want to embark on that dream, right? Now we're going to talk about affirmative action. We talked about the impact of language in the past slide, and affirmative action has many different interpretations. So just so we're all on the same page for the context of this conversation, I want to show you what TRT World has to say of their explanation of affirmative action.
found in university admissions. The decision overturns decades-old policies regarding affirmative action in higher education. Here's what that means for hundreds of thousands of Americans. Also known as positive discrimination, affirmative action first came about in the US in the 1960s as a way to mitigate discrimination for minority races and ethnic groups. Against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, President John F. Kennedy issued an executive order in 1961 mandating affirmative action to prevent racial bias in employment practices. A few years later, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed another order banning discrimination in various situations, including schools and government services. Two cases involving admissions at Harvard University and the University of North Carolina were brought before the Supreme Court in October 2022 by a group called Students for Fair Admissions. The nonprofit group, which was formed by conservative activist Edward Bloom, first filed lawsuits against both schools in 2014. It argued that Harvard's admissions policy related to race infringed the Equal Protection Clause in the US Constitution, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The group called for the overturning of earlier Supreme Court decisions that maintained otherwise. The court's conservative majority was inclined to agree with the plaintiff, ruling 6-3 against UNC and 6-2 against Harvard.
These opinions reestablish the founding principles of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which clearly forbids treating Americans differently by race.
There are concerns that the end of race-conscious admissions will affect the future college admissions of certain demographics and underrepresented groups, as well as enrollment procedures across the US, especially in Ivy League universities.
All right. Can I get the slides back up, please? Thank you. So, according to the American Association for Access, Equity, and Diversity, or the AAAED, affirmative action was instated towards education under the Johnson administration to aid the systemic wrongs that have been committed against ethnic minority groups in America to equal the playing field for employment equality. Grutter versus Bollinger was a Supreme Court case that declared consideration of race must be a part of a holistic review and that racial quotas were impermissible. But the June 2023 Supreme Court decision has far-reaching consequences to many professions, including healthcare. I found a study that focused on dermatology, but physicians from underrepresented racial groups increase healthcare access since they're most likely to practice in underserved areas, care for underinsured patients, and care for patients with poor health status. But applying race-blind policies for medical school admissions could result in 70% fewer accepted underrepresented minority applicants, which could further impede a diversification of the dermatology workforce. But the physician education pipeline to the lack of diversity in the physician workforce is something that would be a trickle-down effect due to this policy. And we just need to have cultural awareness and humility in respect to medicine as well. As the video said, we currently have an unbalanced Supreme Court with recent rulings being conservative-leaning, being 6-2 and 6-3. This is due to court packing. And Rutgers defines court packing as any effort to manipulate the court's membership for partisan means. I want everybody to consider, what implications could an unbalanced Supreme Court have towards legislative decisions? Who you vote for matters, especially in your local elections. Moving forward to abortion, using a medical humanities perspective, authors highlighted the collusion between politics and reproductive health policy and its implications on social determinants of health, such as women's education, employment, housing, racial equity, and overall well-being. Advocates like community leaders, leading scientists, birth attendants, allied health professionals, social workers, we all live the weight of the continuous battle of population control. But I want you to understand the biopolitical implications of what population control is. They stem from an oppressive history of control over women, colonization, and slavery. Combine that with the current US political status filled with polarization and racial turmoil, geopolitical implications can be witnessed around the world. But current legislation forces women to not only travel to other states or countries to access abortion, but has denied them choice of their reproductive freedom. While the Supreme Court's decision mainly benefits individuals, organizations, and companies who sell like contraceptives and technologies and all that, it's a reproductive injustice that is not only gendered, but racialized. If we look at the charts that are on the left, data on abortion by race, it is limited, but on the available data, 38% of recorded abortions happen amongst Black women. And over 4 in 10 of women that are between the ages of 18 and 49 are living in states where abortion has become or will likely become illegal are women of color. 4 in 10, 43%. Variation in the availability of abortions by state due to the overturning of Roe v. Wade will likely result in women of color facing more disproportionate barriers to accessing abortion care. And data revealed that when compared to white counterparts, women of color were more likely to be low income, which is about $42,000 for a family of 3 as of 2019. This is a vulnerable population. Denying women access to abortion service has negative economic consequences because if they do have to travel across state lines, they have to pay for the healthcare fees, they have to pay for travel, for accommodations, and also if they do bring the child to term, they have unplanned expenses. Raising a child's in the teeth, you have to buy milk and buy food and all this other stuff that you have to account for. But it also is known that people of color are more likely to experience certain birth risks and adverse birth outcomes than compared to white people. Many case studies reflect this. Some pregnant women have immigration-related fears. We talked about that earlier. Traveling out of state for an abortion. I would like to live in a society where people didn't have to make choices about their health care due to financial and legal restraints, but we have some work to get there. Increased barriers to abortion for people of color may widen the already existing large disparities in maternal and infant health. This can potentially trickle down to have negative economic consequence for families, which can lead to an increased risk of criminalization for people of color, especially if they're low income. Because if they're low income, they have to find money somewhere, so they resort to stealing or doing other things that are maladaptive. But lastly, I want to call you to the Social Workers Code of Ethics, point 102, self-determination. We have to highlight the importance of allowing others to make their own informed decisions for themselves. We have to give them the tools, but they have to make the decisions for themselves because they have their own goals that they need to satisfy. And people are the experts of their own lives. So we should trust them with that. Now I want to talk about Black voter turnout. So Magnum released a study in 2003 that positioned when Black voters do decide to vote, they mostly consider their community, their fellow brothers and sisters, how they will be impacted. Using the 1996 National Black Election Study, the author tested several hypotheses that detailed the ways that turnout decisions of Black Americans is influenced by trust in government, political engagement, and political efficacy, both at the individual and group levels. And they also stated that one's level of political knowledge correlates with psychological involvement. And psychological involvement is the degree to where one is interested or concerned about politics or feel like political participation is worthwhile or necessary. I want to position that this correlates with access to education, though. Some people don't know where to begin when understanding politics. Having people who can provide education could in return increase political engagement. Like I said at the top of the slide, most Black voters consider their community when they cast their vote. But we have to consider othering because it is an identity and intersectionality issue that converges with larger issues regarding power, privilege, and resource accessibility. Individuals and subgroups within the Black community are marginalized, excluded, or made to feel inferior based on differences such as their nationality, what language they may speak, their income level, or their cultural background. But this dynamic creates divisions within the Black community, despite their shared racial identity, because it reinforces social hierarchical systems in place that already disadvantage certain groups. Similarly, colorism can contribute to othering as well. But I want to bring this up to expose that there are not only external forces, but there are also intercommunal factors that tend to show up regarding Black voter turnout. These are some considerations that go into play when Black voters make their decisions. So now let's look at some mental health trends. I want to start with the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. So it looked at the mental health significance for US Black adults of Barack Obama's 2008 presidential election using this system. They hypothesized that Black adults would experience improved mental health after the first self-identified Black person wins the presidential election. However, their findings expose that an interaction between gender and time showcased that Black men reported 1.01 fewer poor mental health days after the election, whereas Black women did not show a significant difference pre and post, reporting at 0.45 more poor mental health days. Again, I say representation matters. Going to the 2006 presidential election, though, at the time of the research, there were few published studies assessing the impact of mental health and the election. But they used online search data and small surveys, but they found that an increased stress and anxiety followed the election. In states that voted for Clinton, there were 54.6 million more days of poor mental health reported among adults in December of 2016, which is the month after the election, than compared to October, the month prior. Together, the findings suggest that the outcome of the 2016 election had a negative impact on the mental health for voters of the losing candidate overall. Going to the 2020 Household Pulse Survey, it was a nationally represented rapid response survey that was conducted every week from April to July in 2020, and then it was conducted bi-weekly from August to December of 2021. But due to the high nature of the survey, the high frequency of the survey, it implies that we can track week-to-week changes in mental health outcomes, and we can identify things from that. So in the past decade, researchers have documented that elections can lead to an increase in anxiety or depression by measuring biomarkers of stress like cortisol and testosterone. They measure these in voters around election time. The research also shows that closely fought elections can have significant adverse effects on mental health. But we also show that in addition to the increase in self-reported symptoms, it also led to an increased rate of anxiety and depression-related mental health visits and psychotropic medication use. So these are some considerations whenever we think about how the election and how politics affects people in their mental health. Stress, trauma, and health is another thing. Both overt and covert acts of racism influence the psyche. And somatic symptoms, which are chronic symptoms that can develop, physical symptoms in your body, can coincide with excessive maladaptive thoughts, emotions, or behaviors, and they can be connected. These can develop to cause chronic stress and or adverse health behaviors, which can lead to mental and physical health consequences. Think about how you would feel if or when something stressed you out and you had no way of changing it. Just think about that. That's some people's reality, bound by systems that were innately designed to hold them back. Now I want to look at this mental health case scenario. So put yourself in the shoes of David. I'm gonna read this scenario for us. David discloses an upsetting incident at his community college where he attends part-time. He says that someone vandalized a bathroom with racial slurs targeted towards African Americans, who make up a small minority in the college. He did not see the slurs himself, but heard about them. The college quickly painted over the slurs and sent out an email admonishing the behavior, but no further actions were taken. Derek experienced a great deal of anger about the situation. He believes that more of these types of incidents have been happening since the 2016 election, but did not imagine that this would happen at his school. I want you to take one of these questions, and I'm gonna read them to us, but take one of these questions and I want you to answer it in the chat. 1, do you think that this situation has impacted David's health in any way? Question 2, how has this incident affected David's sense of safety or comfort at the college? And 3, in what ways do you think that the school handled this event? And how has it shaped his outlook on his school and community? While y'all are putting your responses in the chat, I will move on to voter mental health. So during the presidential election cycle, it can be extremely difficult to strike a balance between staying informed and taking care of your own mental health. Michigan State University says that anger-infused communication and rhetoric are forces that have grown in political use in the past decade. Anger-infused communication is defined as communication where the source intentionally communicates that issues are caused by an unjust third party who intentionally cause the risk for nefarious purposes. So political anger is aroused when people feel like their values, their goals, or their political opinions are threatened. And we use anger for leverage. We already know what stress and anger does to the body, so why would we want to continue with this pattern? It's very problematic in my opinion, and I believe we should move forward with a solution-focused approach. In today's era of polarization, there's also added pressures, whether that be contentious conversation with your family members, like I said, the rhetoric to incite anger, or the confusion of facts and information on social media. If you're anything like me, you want to stay informed and be in the know, but you get irritated by some of the things you come across. But then on the other side, there are people who doom scroll, which is like seeking out, the negative news and trying to figure out what people are talking about. But do what's best for you. Find a balance. Limit content if you need to. Protect your own mental health. Especially for our youth from marginalized populations, they turn to social media to find a community to help them process events and rhetoric, sometimes with humor, sometimes sharing their own personal experiences, sometimes calling for political action. Social media is so unique because it has essentially given everyone access to a platform. But they're coming here trying to process things with their peers, right? They are coming trying to find jokes in the situation because it's very frustrating. And especially as Black people, we take our frustration and we turn it into joy. And that's something I love about our resilience. We know that heightened political polarization can contribute to race-based, intergenerational, chronic, collective, and or vicarious trauma. Going back to David, he did not see the writings himself, but he heard about it. So David experienced vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, right? And I want to call your attention to the left side of the screen where I have the 12 core concepts. So these are core concepts of traumatic experiences. This is tailored towards the school-age youth. I'm a school social worker, so this is just my resources. That's why I brought it up. But it's applicable to us of voting age as well. So just read over that, some of these things, but it has a great understanding of how traumatic experiences can be formed. And everybody's trauma is different. But lastly, I want to leave you for this slide with some self-care tips. So first, identify and acknowledge your emotions. Allow yourself to feel and process your emotions, whether it's frustration, anger, or hope. Journal, talk to a trusted friend, or use a preferred coping skill that can help you release these feelings constructively. The second tip that I have is take some breaks from social media. The constant streamlines and FYPs of political opinions and debates can be mentally exhausting. So consider taking breaks from social media platforms to protect your own mental health. Do some mindfulness meditations like we started the session with, or speak some life into yourself with self-affirmations. And you can also be creative with your self-care. Use artistic expression. Channel your thoughts and feelings into creative outlets like painting, writing, or music. Creative expression can be a powerful way not only to release stress, but to process your emotions, and you can communicate whenever you don't know the words to say. But also you can use humor and light entertainment. You can balance heavy political content with lighthearted movies, comedy shows, or playful activities that help you laugh and relax. Me personally, I'm quick to throw on the Boondocks. It's something that's gonna make me smile, make me laugh. They're funny, but you have to find something to where you can kind of self-regulate yourself with all this information that's going around. But I do want to highlight political leader mental health as well, because that's something to be concerned about. So let's set the stage. Put yourself in the shoes of the President of the United States. You're leading an entire country. You're making decisions that affect other people's livelihoods. You could face economic crises, public health crises, and other things that we don't mention, that we fail to mention because we fail to realize because it's going on behind the scenes. Ask yourself, how do you think your mental health would be if you were in the president's shoes? Or similar position, like your state's representative, your governor, your mayor, your city council person, and so on. But when people reach high levels of physiological and emotional arousal or stress, their ability to make rational decisions becomes impaired due to clouded judgment. Have y'all ever been cut off in traffic? I live in DC. I'm getting cut off in traffic almost every time I get in my car, if not every time. So it's a frustrating event that happens, but I want to show this as an example. When you're in a rational state of mind and I'm driving my car, if I'm being rational, I'm like, okay, maybe they didn't see me. I'm glad we didn't wreck, trying to be positive. But, when you're mad and you have that clouded judgment and you're driving and you're trying to get somewhere and they cut you off, now you want to roll your window down. Now you want to exchange words and do sign language. All right. But you see what it is. So let's put it to the president. They must make decisions, right? They have a cabinet with advisors that should help with the decision-making process as well. But what happens in the wake of a national emergency when all advisors are also experiencing world events for the first time, being stressed themselves? Consider that. So we talk about allostatic load and self-regulatory capacities. So allostatic load is the compounded effect of chronic stress and life events on the body that can cause certain biological processes and systems to become dysregulated. Some professions like social workers, we call those somatic symptoms. And then over on the other side, the self-regulatory capacity is literally somebody's ability to control their own behavior, thoughts, and feelings. How much can you regulate yourself? We combine these together and we say that they help determine a leader's affect arousal levels, which can play critical roles in the dynamic between stress and effective decision making. A politician's goals should aim to curtail concerns of the communities in which they serve, not self-interest. So we have to reinforce the importance of voting because we elect these people to be our voice. For this slide, I want to highlight Bill Clinton. We see it right here. He gave a speech at the memorial service for the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. To recap, I wasn't there, I wasn't born then, but to recap for those who were, Clinton immediately marshaled federal resources to respond to the attack. He also traveled to Oklahoma City to memorialize the victims, comfort survivors, and advocate for new anti-terrorism legislation. In doing so, it led to a successful federal law enforcement investigation, as well as the acknowledgement of a traumatized population. Not only did Clinton reflect the nation's grief and sadness, he also backed it up by channeling those emotions into strong policy proposals on the behalf of those affected constituents. Various authors stated that he found a way to embrace the country to help them channel their grief, their confusion, and channel it towards action. This is an optimal crisis response. We want to encourage the community that needs to be touched, not only in times of distress, but we have to be diverse too. America is diverse with so many cultures and so many different ways of life. We have to make sure that we acknowledge at least all these people. Many have attested that this was the turning point in the Clinton presidency, though. Moving forward to some roles of advocacy. So as a social worker, we have an ethical commitment to social justice. It's in our code of ethics. Actually, in the code of ethics, it says social workers pursue social change, particularly with and on behalf of vulnerable and oppressed individuals and groups of people. Social work is political. Social work is political. So if you're not a social worker, that's fine too. We still have some roles that you can do. So here are some things, starting with the public educator. What do? You will inform and educate the public on key political issues and raise awareness and encourage civic engagement. So that could be like hosting informational workshops, writing op-eds or articles, or developing education materials like pamphlets or videos. Or you can be a grassroots organizer. They mobilize and engage the community members at the local level to take collective action on political or social issues. They organize rallies, protests, petitions, and raise awareness. You can be a community advocate. You can represent the interests and the concerns of a specific community, ensuring that their voices are heard in political discussions and policymaking processes. So you can attend public meetings, advocate for community needs, and serve as a liaison between the community and the policymakers. You could be a media specialist. Almost everybody has social media. You can use your digital platform to amplify political messages, mobilize online communities, and influence public opinion or policymaking. You can be a voter mobilizer. That's like registering voters, organizing transportation to polling places, or educating voters about their rights in the voting processes. And lastly, you can also be a donor. You can donate to funds. You can organize fundraising events, write grant proposals, build relationships with other organizations. These roles differ, and they have very diverse pathways for individuals to engage in political advocacy, depending on your skills, your resources, and your interests. There's space for everyone. All right, some actionable steps. First thing, we want to stay informed on political developments. If you see right here on the left under the Capitol building, this is Ground News. It's a website that takes news articles and shows you how conservative or liberal leaning they are. It's a great way to filter for unbiased information on political developments. So I really encourage you to check out this website. But some other things that you can do, you can engage in grassroots movements, write legislators, network with other professionals for collective action, and you can provide resources and support to effective clients. Some suggested solutions. Start with community. We have to create an inclusive decision-making process. Establish community advisory boards or councils that can represent the diverse needs of the community, whether that be racial, social, Financial, we need diverse members to have seats at the table. This makes room for transparency, but it can also ensure that decisions reflect the community's actual needs. When people feel like their voices are heard and their input is valued, the trust in local leaders and community initiative grows, and that leads to higher levels of engagement and collaboration. Political leaders also should go into communities and meet with citizens to understand the community's needs firsthand. But lastly, we should also use community health workers. They have been proven to be cost effective and reduce costs and prevent readmission rates for health concerns. Because they share language and culture usually with their patients, they can better understand the communities because they're already in there. Greater trust has been seen in these provider-patient relationships, and it leads to greater patient involvement through the decision-making process with adherence to treatment and follow-through. Moving with the system approach, what are the benefits of using this in policy as well? Moving on to trust expertise, we need to humanize experts and make them accessible. Host events where doctors, scientists, academics can interact with the community in non-formal settings where they can ask questions, have workshops, or community fairs. Allow space to engage on a personal level, because that can break down some barriers. Engage in collaboration. Involve community members in their research, policy design, health interventions. They can integrate their lived experience and their knowledge, and they can collaborate to develop solutions that are both driven by expert-informed and community-driven solutions. Lastly, highlight success stories that are driven by data and results. Share stories of expert advice leading to positive outcomes. Present data and examples that show how expert recommendations have successfully addressed local issues. It has happened. And I want to bring it to the Black perspective with the School of Social Work. So we have 6 postulates. Social justice. We want everyone to have equal rights and opportunities, so the society can operate as fair and equitable. Number 2 is diversity. We need different representations of culture, economic status, political status, and social makeups. Internationalization. We need international collaboration and relations for information exchange. Vivification. We take an inclusionary, not exclusionary approach to highlighting diversity. Affirmation. Celebrating the richness and the productivity of people and the resilience, especially of Black folks. And strengths kind of goes hand in hand with affirmations. You can find a strength in every situation. If we think back to David's situation, what is a strength from him? He saw racist ideology in his bathroom at his school. A strength that I pulled from that situation is he's still going to school because he still wants his education. And we can affirm him for that. Trauma-informed care should also be considered. If we think about immigrants that we kind of highlighted earlier, especially if they're refugees or asylum seekers, they may have endured some traumatic events such as violence, persecution, or dangerous migration journeys. By providing trauma-informed care, it's essential because we can ensure that services are delivered in a way that does not re-traumatize individuals and instead promotes healing. And lastly, I want to leave you with my favorite word, Sonder. And is defined as the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. Intersectionality and trauma-informed, they both collide. People have personal lived experiences that make them who they are today. Allow them to tell you who they are because they are their own experts. And lastly, I want to leave you with some healthy dialogue tips before we wrap up. So make spaces for healthy dialogues to happen. It's so crucial that we have healthy dialogues. First tip, listen to understand, not to respond or judge. Ask questions and stay curious. Number 2, consider multiple features of your family relationships when deciding what to say. Consider past experiences and conversations, the current state of that relationship, and how this conversation might affect the future of your relationship. And 3, accept the reality that you may never agree. Even though some families may start off with the same worldview, people and their beliefs develop and change over time as we grow and experience new things, new cultures, new ways of thinking, new ways of life. You have to accept that you may need to live in disagreement, and that's okay. But at the bottom, I have some ways to encourage healthy dialogue. And I have a few questions that you can ask to kind of help feed this discussion. So 1, focus on listening and understanding. Some questions that you could ask. Can you help me understand your perspective on this issue? What life experiences have shaped your views on this topic? The second one is finding common ground. What values or goals do you think we both share, even if our approaches differ? The third one, encouraging thoughtfulness and reflection. How do you think this issue impacts different communities or groups of people? Number 4, reframe the discussion positively. How do you think we can approach this conversation in a way that is respectful and constructive for us both? Be inviting, open dialogue and questioning. What's a question you wish more people would ask about this issue before they form their opinion? And lastly, we need to foster empathy. That is the most crucial thing. If you are in the other person's shoes, how do you think you might view this topic? How can we bring more compassion into our conversations about politics, especially for those who are affected by these policies? So to wrap up, we talked about supporting vulnerable populations. We have to prioritize equity and inclusion in policy and practice. Multidisciplinary experimentation, where we leverage diverse expertise to address complex societal changes. We went through 4 real-world ripple effects, where we understand the broader impacts of policy decisions on communities. We talk about Black voter turnout and mental health, where we recognize the intersection of civic engagement and mental health trends with marginalized communities. Voter and political leader mental health, where we advocate for mental health support systems within the whole political arena. Some roles of advocacy, where we empowered individuals and organizations to drive meaningful change, and some actionable steps to help you implement evidence-based strategies that promote mental wellness and civic engagement and systemic reform. So at this time, I will now be taking questions from the chat, but please also scan the QR code to take the survey.